new second thought video, why social democracy isn't good enough. So this is kind of where I'm at. I've always, since 2016, the initial rise of Bernie, I've always called myself a socdem, a social democrat, which typically entails keeping our market system, keeping our capitalist system, potentially you could say, but having a strong social welfare safety net. And different social democrats will ask for different guarantees. So, typically you've got like universal healthcare, universal education. I would go as far to say I would have the government provide, housing, food, basic services like internet even should be guaranteed to every citizen. That's kind of where I'm at. I think these can be achieved with our current economic system as it stands. But obviously socialists would say otherwise. We need a separate economic system entirely. And I don't necessarily disagree, in the medium to long term. In the short term, I think we can and should strive for social democracy as a absolute bare minimum. But socialists, if I'm not mistaken, would say if you maintain capitalism, what you're also maintaining is the profit motive, and that profit motive will always lead to exploitation. And I don't necessarily disagree. I think this is a real issue that should be addressed. The other thing that maybe socialists would say, but I would say that, what might be an issue against just having social democracy, and not long-term Marxism, you could say. Can we achieve social democracy, maintain markets, maintain capitalism, and not exploit the third world, not exploit anyone? That's the thing. Can we achieve a social democratic society that maintains capitalism, that doesn't have any form of exploitation? The cool thing about social democracy is that it should remove or at least severely limit the ability to exploit people in your own country. So if we achieve that in the US, great. Everyone's got a bare minimum standard of living, everyone's got high wages, things like that. But are we still relying on slave labor in Thailand to create this shirt that I'm wearing? That is a big question that I have as someone who who closely identifies as a social democrat. I actually don't super like labels. Am I a socdem? Because of certain things that I want. Am I actually a socialist? I don't know. I don't really care. I don't really care to define myself in those ways. I call myself a progressive. That's about the closest concrete thing I would define myself as. But I am curious as to what Second Thought has to say in regard to why social democracy isn't enough. So let's see.
For social democrats, capitalism is something that can be contained, reformed, or compensated for.
That is approximately where I'm at least in the short term.
Depending on the social democrat, capitalism is either a necessary evil or a genuinely positive economic model that simply needs to be reined in from its excesses and guided in a positive direction. In contrast, for
No, I wouldn't call myself either of those. I will say I'm open to there being certain things that certain positives that market systems can provide, that the simple notion of supply and demand, I think, can be a positive way to inform commodity production, I guess. But I don't think capitalism is necessarily necessary, I guess, is my ultimate point.
For socialists, capitalism is something that must be replaced by a fundamentally different economic model. One that is not driven by profit and in which production and distribution are organized democratically, not by wealthy and powerful individuals.
And I agree with that. So does that make me a socialist? Maybe. I don't know. I do agree with what he just said there in terms of what we should strive to achieve long term, medium to long term. Can we achieve a system of social democracy that doesn't exploit anyone? If not, then we need to take steps beyond social democracy. If we can achieve social democracy in the US, that would be great for Americans. But if we can't stop exploiting others, then it's clearly not enough, and we need some form of global socialism, global Marxism, and I'm open to that.
We most likely agree on social justice, our criticisms of laissez-faire capitalism, and on a number of...
Yes, laissez-faire capitalism, bad. I stress this. I stress this in every video. Free markets are bad. The free market is a bad thing. Markets in general, like I said, the very notion of supply and demand can be useful maybe, but without severe, strict regulation of those markets, they will always lead to exploitation. Maybe socialists would say no matter how much you regulate, there will be exploitation no matter what. I'm open to that. But, I'm not going to say definitively whether that's an absolute. But yeah, I absolutely agree with second thought here for sure.
Capitalism isn't something that we can rehabilitate.
I'm more than open to that. It is one of those things where, like, let's try social democracy in the short term and see if we can rehabilitate capitalism globally. If we can achieve social democracy and keep our markets and regulate profit enough that it doesn't become exploitative, especially globally, perfect. If that can't happen and we realize it can't happen, then I'm more than open to taking the next steps. Absolutely.
They only make sure that the one guy doesn't go too far and still gets most of the money. And regardless, people...
Maybe in some cases he deserves most of the money. Like, I work for an app startup with like 10 or 15 employees. The CEO, the boss, he does like 99% of the work. And if he stopped, there'd be no more product and there would be no more my job. Like, period. So, like, I'm more than happy with him earning a lot more than I do. If the workplace was more democratic, do I think, I and my coworkers could maybe vote to have more of a share and better benefits while still maintaining his more wealth than us? I do believe that, which is why I do absolutely advocate for workplace democracy in almost every case. But to say this as an absolute, I don't necessarily agree with second thought here.
Even if they had full democratic agency, still need to produce a profit for their company and their economy.
Yeah. I do agree with this in regard to like socialists and Marxists. The profit, like medium, like short term, maybe we can achieve a really high quality form of like ultra social democracy globally, maybe. Long term, I my gut says profit is an issue, and profit will result in, inherent problems that can't be solved without eliminating the profit motive. So I do believe long term, however it looks, whether it is through a socialist economic system, whatever that might look like, we do need to move away from profit being the motivator for commodity production. I do believe that inherently.
So the typical capitalist race to the bottom still applies, as everyone tries to outcompete for higher profit margins. But that's domestically, where workers' exploitation is relatively low and compensated for by a good safety net and universal amenities. Salaries in social democracies are high and public services are great. The problem with social democracy is that in order for capitalists to make good profits under this arrangement, where they pay their workers slightly better and don't get to hoard as much, somebody somewhere needs to be exploited a lot more.
No! He got me! Oh, that's a gut shot. Shot through the heart. He wins. Exactly what I was talking about. Yeah. I'm more than open to that. Like, social democracy might make things livable in the United States where it currently isn't. You know what I mean? But, to me, it's an open question. To maybe second thought, it's a question with a clear answer. Can it happen without global third world exploitation? My gut says probably not. I will say that. My gut says probably not, which is why I do think social democracy probably isn't enough. You know what I mean? Like, what that next step is, if it is a form of socialism, it probably is. I can't say definitively because I haven't read any theory. But that's what he's about to get into, which I'm very interested to hear his perspective, which like I said, I can guess his perspective. Like, he will say, because the profit motive exists, there will always be someone to be exploited. And I don't necessarily disagree. I don't necessarily agree. Maybe there can be a system where a for-profit system where people do not exploit others, but it would require, a lot of effort, and maybe just doing socialism instead eliminates that effort while still achieving the same benefits. I'm open to that too.
But the fact that it benefits from exploitation and imperialism, particularly of this kind, shows the limits that a social democracy runs into when it agrees to follow the rules of global capitalism.
But maybe you can have social democracy without the exploitation. That's all I'm saying. I'm open to that not being the case, and if that's not the case, then we'll take the next step, like I already said. But let's at least try and achieve a hyper social democracy that doesn't have exploitation. And then we'll go from there.
That's because under social democracy, capital retains tremendous power, which it can use in things like capital strikes. A capital strike, like a labor strike, happens when capital refuses to work. Except capitalists don't actually work, so really a capital strike is when capitalists refuse to invest, sitting on their hands and piles of cash, and or deciding to move their capital to another country in what's called capital flight. Because social democratic societies protect the sanctity of private capital like all capitalist societies do, meaning that they are very apprehensive of expropriating capital even in times of crisis where literally one person can screw over hundreds of others, social democracies are incredibly vulnerable to backpedaling. Mitterrand sailed into the presidency on the promise of being a radical social democrat, bringing the mixed economy model to France with the surprising backing of the Communist Party. He did all the things I listed earlier, raised the minimum wage, nationalized a few industries, gave people more holidays and a shorter work week, raised pensions, invested in high-speed rail, all sorts of good stuff that made people's lives meaningfully better almost overnight. But just 2 years in, capital responded. Foreign and domestic investments dried up, and Mitterrand had to completely reverse course in what was called the austerity turn. Multiple nationalized industries were reprivatized, public spending on things like Social Security was massively cut, and new taxes were imposed on workers. It was a brutal blow to the French working class, and a total betrayal of the promises that Mitterrand got elected on. And Sweden's gone down the same path, just a bit more slowly and more recently, or a lost election, but just because things got too good for everyday people and they weren't as exploitable as before. To resist these tendencies takes tremendous political will, tremendous social engagement, and extremely high unionization. Things that can be chipped away at for years by capitalists and that can easily go out the window when the end of the month is looking lean. It's not that social democracy...
Okay. This was maybe, at least for me, the most eye-opening second thought video yet in terms of convincing me that social democracy won't be enough. He said a lot of things that I didn't really think too much about. The ways, the capital owning class can retaliate against, as he said it, people getting just a little bit more, better benefits. Those were things I didn't really have a lot of perspective on. And what I also appreciated was how he showed a real world example with what happened in France in the 80s. So that is telling me that maintaining an economic system that is based on profit, you could call that capitalism, whatever forget labels at this point. If your economic system is based on extracting profit, the most amount of profit, and that is what informs, labor, that's what informs commodity production. Yeah. It's maybe you could, with unthinkable amounts of regulation around the world, regulate it away, But ultimately, I do fully believe that we need to move away from an economic system based around extracting profit. I can say that definitively. I probably could have said that before this video, but this video really kind of gave me that extra push. Now, what that economic system will look like, I don't fully know. The problem is there seem to be many, many different types of economic systems that can exist that don't operate on the profit motive. Like socialism and communism aren't just one thing. There are a lot of different things. There are a lot of different methods to achieve, and there are a lot of different, nuances to their economic models. So I can't say what I think the proper, most, utilitarian economic model will look like. All I know that I can say today, right now, having watched this video, is the profit motive must be overcome. And if that's what makes me a socialist, fine, you can call me a socialist. But no, this was very interesting. And like I said, maybe my favorite second thought video so far in terms of like convincing me that, yeah, there may not be a way, a feasible way to maintain some form of capitalism, some form of the profit motive.